Part 22. So we're going to tackle question number 8. And the question number 8 is dealing with another messianic proof or topic. And this is it. What about the red thread in the temple associated with the scapegoat sacrifice? Now, if you're not sure what I mean by this question, it's all right. Let me explain. This is a concept that Christians use as sort of like a text proof that Jesus was the Messiah. So it is said, and only according to the Talmud is it said, that during the Yom Kippur sacrifice, a red string would be tied to one of the goats. The high priest would place his hands on the head of the goat and confess the sins of Israel and ask for atonement. Well, long story short, it was said that if the sins of Israel were forgiven, the string would turn white once the goat had reached the wilderness. And according to the Talmud, when the temple was built, this tradition continued, but this time they would tie a red string to the door of the sanctuary, and it would turn white if God accepted their sacrifice on Yom Kippur. It was reported around 30 AD, when the Yom Kippur sacrifices were given, that the thread would no longer turn white. And it is said that that's a sign, because Jesus had died as the ultimate sacrifice, and God no longer needed or accepted this animal sacrifice for their atonement. This story no doubt has caught the attention of many Messianics and Christians, including myself in the past. And I know I personally used it as, yet again, another argument or kind of my own personal aha that Jesus had to be the Messiah. You know, it's like another sign. Why not? I will confess, though, that I had not actually looked into this issue very deeply before even touting this as a sign, as I'm also convinced that others have not objectively analyzed this as well. I will also confess that I had never even opened up the Talmud to read this part for myself. And I am convinced that not many Christians and Messianics that believe this is to be some kind of sign have taken the time to read this in the Talmud either. And if you're one who believes this to be a sign of the Messiah, well, I ask you then, have you actually read this in the Talmud in its context? Or is it just something you believe because someone told you about it? And that's what I'm talking about. We tend to believe things just because someone has told us about it without really taking the time to be diligent to do our own homework. The strange thing about this subject is that we have to use the Talmud, to use this as a sign through this Talmudic story that Jesus is the Messiah or that it's a sign of him. It would seem that the same Christians or Messianics that speak really ill of the Talmud are then okay to turn right around and then somehow applaud the Talmud by accepting the story written about the red thread. It's another case, I think, of cherry picking what bolsters your argument while ignoring everything else around it. But that's beside the point. So let's dig into this topic a little bit and see what we find. One very astute observation that one can make for starters, is this. When reading Leviticus 16 about the Yom Kippur instructions, you'll actually not find any instruction given to anyone about tying a red thread to a goat or tying a red thread to the door of the sanctuary. So where did this tradition come from then? Well, beats me. We know that in time, it's easy for external traditions to creep in. Was it wrong that they did this with the thread? Well, heck, I don't know. What I do know, though, is that this was never something Yehovah gave as an instruction for the high priest to be doing. So, right or wrong, I don't know. Another point to throw out there is that we know by Ezekiel and a few other prophets that the animal sacrifices will be continued in the Messianic era when the third temple is built. And the Messiah who is to come will be offering sacrifices himself. Now, if you don't excuse away this concept with biblical gymnastics and just believe the Bible for what it clearly says, then we have to acknowledge that the idea that Jesus was supposed to end the sacrifices is problematic. The animal sacrifices were never done away with because of Jesus. according to the Tanakh. That wasn't the purpose of what the Tanakh clearly says the Messiah is going to do. If the excuse is used that, okay, so let's say, okay, we'll accept that animal sacrifices will be done in the Messianic kingdom, well, they're just a memorial of sorts. Well, then you'd also have to say that pre-Christ animal sacrifices were the same. Yet, when you're careful to look at what the Tanakh says about when an offering was made, it is said that the animal brought atonement. That sacrifice brought atonement. It never said it brought a covering or that it brought a foreshadowing. No, it was the priest offering the animal atoned for the sins of Israel. In the same way, they'll continue when the temple is restored again. Even the Apostle Paul in the New Testament is bringing sin offerings to the temple post-Christ. But I digress a little bit. So again, right or wrong, Yehovah did not instruct the priests to tie the red thread on the animal sacrifices, and those will continue in the Messianic age. So those are just kind of my two thoughts regarding the red string and the animal sacrifices. So did this story about the red thread actually happen? I mean, I don't know. Was it legend? Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, it probably did. I see the Talmud as more of a historic book, so sure, it probably did happen. But can I hang my faith on Jesus because a red thread happened to not turn white anymore during a ceremony where that was never even an instruction from Yehovah? Forgive me for being just a little bit skeptical. When a Christian looks at this story, it's an automatic assumption that, it has to be related to Christ, of course. But why is this conclusion the first one to be jumped on? I have heard it as a common line of thought that the strip of red did not turn white because it's attributed, of course, to the fact that despite the unnecessary need for the animal sacrifices now, the Jews rejected Jesus, and that it was no longer turning white because these Jews could no longer find atonement in the temple. And here's a thought for what it's worth. Pay close attention to what I'm about to say, because this is a very thought-worthy point of consideration. What if the red wool did not turn white because of the masses of Jews who were following a false Messiah? In other words, rather than attributing the reason for the red wool not turning white due to the rejection of Jesus or because you don't need him anymore, it could easily be reasoned that the red wool stopped turning white because people had been led astray by a false idol. The second interpretation would be far more consistent with the whole of the Talmud if you've actually read it. Now, I'm not making a suggestion that this second part is the correct understanding. I'm not saying that's why it stopped turning red, but I'm making a point that we often jump to a conclusion based on the lenses we are wearing without taking the time just to be objective. When looking at the part of the Talmud which speaks about the red thread turning white, it would be useful to put this into context. Surprise, surprise. This part of the Talmud begins with a discussion of a deteriorating spiritual condition of the Jewish people throughout the Second Temple period and into the 1st century. The period the Talmud more specifically talks about is this time during which a man by the name of Shimon HaTzadik was the high priest. And he was a righteous priest, but during the 40 years he was priest, however, the spiritual decline of the Jews became more and more prevalent towards the end of his life. And this was in the 1st century. There were 5 miracles accounted for that would happen during this priest's life. And towards the end of Simon's life, or Shimon, the miracles actually were starting to fade, and it was paralleled with the spiritual decline of the Jewish people. And here were the miracles. The first one was that I'm not exactly sure what this is, I haven't studied that out, but they would cast a lot called the La Hashem, and that would appear in the right hand of the priest during the Yom Kippur service. And then the number 2 miracle was what we've been talking about. The strip of red wool would turn white. Number 3, the pyre, I think that's the wood, if I remember that correctly. The wood on the altar didn't require any additional wood to sustain a strong fire. Number 4, the bread used in the temple would satisfy the priests much longer than usual during this time. And number 5, the temple menorah would always remain lit until the priest would use its fire to kindle the next day's lamp. Now, after the death of Simon, the people regressed very quickly into a downward spiritual spiral, and all these 5 mentioned miracles quickly diminished. The spiritual decay of the Jews had hit a low at this point, and that's the lowest point ever recorded during the Second Temple period. It is recorded that the time of the death of the high priest was 40 years before the Second Temple's destruction, and that does parallel with the time Christian scholars say that Jesus died. So, just an objective point of view, why pick out just that one miracle? Why pinpoint that one when you've got 4 others that kind of go with it? You know what I mean? And the questions that could also be asked are these. What horrible sins did the children of Israel indulge in during these last 40 years that the temple, that proved so devastating to their spiritual subsistence, you know? What brought about the end of these miraculous events that were commonplace in the years that Simon served as high priest and the years that followed his death? And when we look at the history of Israel, this is the pattern. Whenever they would decline spiritually, Yehovah tended to remove himself from his people. And this was the case with the destruction of the first temple. The destruction of the second temple was not unlike the first. And, as we know, history tends to repeat itself. Sorry, I lost my spot. Okay, as an objective question, I really do ask, if Jesus was an end to the need for the temple sacrifices, why did Yehovah wait 40 years, which at this time is like a whole generation of people? Why did he wait that long to get rid of the temple? And for that matter, why would something that had been so holy to Yehovah be allowed to be desecrated by pagans? Regardless of its need or not, the temple was still an active part of how Yehovah related to his people. Why just toss it aside like garbage, even if you do believe that Jesus is the final sacrifice, Nothing about that passes the sniff test to me. So without full knowledge of what's really going on contextually in the Talmud, as well as the history of the Jews in the first century, I could see how it would be easy to jump on the Jesus conclusion by not looking at the context of the Talmud as it records the sins of the Jews that brought about the destruction of the Second Temple. It is easy to sidestep that crucial backdrop of the cherry-picked line about the red thread. But what is it they say? Context is key. And that applies to more than just scriptures, right? My faith is not, nor has ever been, based on stories within the Talmud or anything other than the words of Yehovah. The writings of men cannot trump the writings of Yehovah, ever. That's the end of this part.